what do Fischer, Kasparov and Carlsen have in common, besides each of them thinking he's the GOAT? They all love the King's Indian defense. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and within the next 15 minutes you will understand this opening better than 95% of your opponents. Let's start from the very beginning. You played against the Queen's pawn move, pawn to d4. Then you respond with knight to f6. In this position, White can play pawn to c4, bishop f4, knight to f3. We'll talk about all these options. Let's begin from the most annoying one. Addressing the elephant in the room, the London system. What do you do then? Well, as always, you fianchetto your kingside bishop. And the big advantage of the King's Indian defense, and I can tell you this after analyzing tons of games of my students, is that you don't mess up with the King's Indian. While playing this, you don't get checkmated. Your king is rock solid right here. You castled it early, you overprotected it with this fianchettoed bishop, you're rock solid right here. Also, your overall structure is very well defended. Therefore, you're not getting checkmated, you're not blundering anything in this game. I mean, of course you can catch up later, but at least early in the game, that's not happening. Now, White goes bishop d3, setting up their perfect London system, and you go pawn to d6, another trademark move of the King's Indian. Now, typically in the Queen's Gambit, you put the pawn to d5, and that's perfectly fine. But a slight disadvantage of this move is that now the position is more or less symmetric, and since White starts the game, they have an upper hand, and you're kind of defensive, you're trying to equalize. Versus in the King's Indian, you're having this asymmetric pawn structure, and you want to counterattack. You do not want to be a defender. And that's why all these aggressive players, Fischer, Kasparov, that's why they loved it so much. By the way, I just realized they had one more thing in common. They couldn't stand Karpov, but that's not a story. Now, so you go d6, and the London player is already getting upset. Now this bishop is getting barricaded along this diagonal. The knight can never jump to e5 because it will be captured by the pawn, and therefore you already nullify a lot of typical ideas of a London system player. Now White continues, they go pawn to c3. What do you do next? Since you've got this pawn on d6, not on d5, typically you're going to strike in the center with pawn to e5, although it may require some preparation. Like right now you cannot do this because White has way too many pieces and pawns controlling this square, but you can easily prepare that. And you usually develop your knight to c6, which is a nice development move, but also it supports this central advancement from here. Sometimes if you can't get the knight right here for some reason, you can put it to d7, and from here it will also support that e5 advancement. But right now you can just play the most obvious move. White plays knight to d2, they're happy, they have just set up this clear London system setup, but you're also happy, because now you're already getting ready to play pawn to e5 and you seize the initiative. You attack this bishop on f4, and now the OGs know that to take is a mistake, right? But most chess players are not subscribers of this channel, they don't know this, and they automatically take when they can. And now, even though they think that they have two attackers against this pawn and they're about to win the pawn, what they failed to realize is that now there is actually a double attack, not only to this bishop on f4, but also there is this tricky discovered attack of the other one on d3. And because of the double attack, White cannot save his pieces, and you're winning the game basically on the spot. And even if you couldn't win the bishop for some reason, let's say White played some other moves earlier, anyway, you destroyed the London system, right? It's not the thing anymore. You destroyed it. And from here, you're already attacking. You attack this bishop. You can support the pawn and keep pushing it forward to attack those two pieces. Overall, you would have a great position anyway. But right now, you're just winning because of the double attack. Let's say White trades on e5, and now you can pick up this hanging bishop on d3. You are up bishop. Congratulations, you're supposed to win. You're also cutting White off this castling opportunity. White cannot castle. And by the way, I know sometimes you guys tell me it's just an extra piece. I mean, it's not totally winning. Let me show you one game so that you see exactly how to convert it. All right, White captures this pawn on c7, and White is relatively happy. White thinks, okay, at least I'm having a couple of pawns. Black played queen to b5, a really smart move with an immediate threat to this pawn on b2, but also another hidden threat. From here, the queen can go to c6 and attack both the bishop and this pawn on g2. Quite a tricky move, but now we're also hitting this pawn on b2. White defended it, and now queen c6 would be a great move, but there's bishop f5, which is even stronger. Hitting the queen, gaining one more tempo. White tried to block it and to counterattack the bishop, but Black came up with one more trick. This time they sacrificed the knight, and on the next turn played rook to e8 to pin the queen down to the king, and now Black is winning the queen, and Black keeps attacking. Now let's move on to the main line, where white plays pawn to c4, develops a knight, and grabs the center. This is what you're going to face most frequently. Now, it looks frightening at first to encounter all these three advanced pawns, but we'll see how to deal with them. First off, you can play d6 just to slow them down a little bit so that it's not easy for white to play e5 and attack your knight, and mostly they won't, because if they do, you just take. And after the recapture, take this queen on d1, which would push either the king or this knight to go to a non-favorable square, and then this pawn on e5 only becomes a liability. Your knight can jump forward and attack it. Alright, therefore probably they will not play this because it's bad for white. They'll typically just develop somehow. They could develop their minor pieces to slightly different squares, but it's not going to matter because your setup is always the same. You first castle, put in your king to safety, and on the next move there is also a bright idea. As always in the King's Indian, we aim to play e5. That's what you're going to do most of the time. You strike in the center, your pawn from d6 supports this advancement, and also there is one long-term idea. You've got this really strong sniper on g7, and you want to clear this diagonal for your bishop. If you are successful in doing so, the bishop will put long-term pressure on your opponent along this diagonal, and that is of course nice for you. Now, your pawns will typically castle. That is the main move. What if they don't? Actually, if they take or push the pawn forward, that only makes it easier for you, because you won't have to deal with this pressure anymore. But again, in most cases, they will simply castle. And now the main line goes knight to c6, pawn to d5, and after that there is a ton of theory. But to avoid that, because it's very complicated to learn all that, I'd recommend that you move your knight to a6, which is a far less known option, but it's equally good. And of course you may be wondering, Igor, but they say that a knight on the ream is dim. Well, if it's dim, you can increase the brightness of your monitor, right? It's not a big deal. But, being serious, we're going to reroute the knight to c5. We do know that this pawn will do something. It'll either be pushed forward or take on c5. But either way, this square on c5 will become available for our knight, and we're going to land into this excellent square. That's the idea behind knight to a6. Now, another general note. If you analyze any of these variations with Stockfish, very often it will tell you that white has some advantage in King's Indian defense, but I would disregard that. It's very dynamic, very counter-attacking thing with a lot of interesting opportunities. And by the way, Kasparov endorsed you to play the King's Indian defense. I know this for a fact. I've been coaching for many years, and back in the day, I had a student, and we were discussing the King's Indian. And I've told him, did you notice that Kasparov, Fischer, Nakamura nowadays played King's Indian a lot, but then as they got to the very highest level, they stopped playing this. Do you know why? And the student said, no, I don't. And I said, well, of course I don't know for sure. I didn't ask them, but I think that, it stops being that much fun because objectively speaking, yeah, it is slightly less solid compared to the most solid chess openings, such as the Queen's Gambit, the standard, right? And the student was like, okay, let's ask him. And he's picking up his phone and called and then hey, Garry, what do you think about the King's Indian defense? And I thought to myself, that's pretty cool. But we got a chance to ask Kasparov what does he think about it and whether it's suitable for you or not. And Garry was like, hey, yeah, I think you gotta study it, but of course on this level it's very good to play it, very counter-attacking, blah, blah. So basically he endorsed you, all right? We got his endorsement. You can play it. Now, d5 here is the move that you're going to see most frequently. White is trying to seize space, but on the other side, now you've got this excellent square on c5 for your knight, and you also hit this pawn on e4 twice. That's why I would need to defend it somehow. Let's say they play queen to c2 and also guard this pawn. Now there's a very important move for you to play. Notice that if you play just some random move, white will play b4 and will kick your knight out and will also expand on the queen side. Of course, we do not want this. Therefore, you gotta play a5 to secure this square so that white can't push the pawn forward. In that case, you would just capture it. And now you have this long-term excellent knight on c5. Now, what's good about this position is that we're getting into this positional chess territory. And usually your opponents have very little idea of what to do here. And they will do all sort of mistakes and wrong plans, right? One of the very common ones is playing a3, trying to prepare this b4 advancement, but it's a big positional blunder because now you've got an excellent move pawn to a4, which fixes this square once and for all, and there will never be an opportunity for white to push the pawn forward because you just capture en passant and the pawn is guarded, right? White just messed up really badly. Therefore, playing a3 would only fix the queenside for your benefit, and now you also have this new opportunity potentially down the line. Another common positional mistake is moving bishop to g5. In most cases, it is wrong for white to do that in the king's Indian defense, because bishop frankly is doing nothing there. Your knight on f6 is already defended, right? So that pin does not bother you in any way. Moreover, as you kick the bishop out, which you should, as the bishop moves away, it's kind of out of the game, a little bit on the side, not really doing much. Moreover, you can even take advantage of this bishop and keep expanding, and you gain extra tempos. You were going to attack on the king side anyway, and now you can gain those extra tempos. The bishop comes back, you can now keep chasing it, knight to h5. Maybe you can take on g3 down the line, but even more so, your knight will probably land to this excellent square f4, and you're going to play f5, which is your main way of expanding and launching your attack on the king side. If white captures, you're going to bring your bishop out with a tempo, hitting the queen, life's good, you're already attacking, and white still has no idea what to do. Let me also show real quick my game that I played as black against a FIDE master, because I think it will illustrate those common plans of the king's Indian defense. Because of course, you will not be able to remember all these opening variations, and there is no need to. You need to understand these general concepts, where to put your pieces, what is your plan, and what are those common errors. All right, so here we can see that position is very similar to what we have seen before. White fianchettled the bishop on the king side as well, and that doesn't make a very big difference. I also rerouted this knight to c5, just like we have seen, and now like goes knight h5, getting ready to play f5, which is your main attacking plan. You want to expand on the king side, and the first step is to get the knight out of the way and then to push this pawn forward, and you start seizing that space. Anyway, it was white to play. White played bishop e3, and I continue with pawn to f5. Sometimes in such positions, you can overprotect this knight by going pawn to b6 so that it is rock solid. And if white ever captures, you recaptures with a pawn, and your position remains to be rock solid. That's a nice move to play, but I didn't want to be defensive. I wanted to attack right away. I played f5. White captured on c5. And in most of the cases, it is a positional mistake. Why is that so? Think about it this way. It is a good bishop of white. Because white's pawn structure in the middle of the board is on light squares, this bishop is kind of bad. It doesn't have that many squares to go to even, if you think about it. It can only go 2 squares, and both of them don't do all that much, right? But this bishop is actually a really good one. It controls these 2 powerful diagonals, and white does not want to trade it off. And in general, a bishop in chess is a little bit stronger than a knight. Therefore, in most cases, that is wrong. Now, black recaptures, and here white goes rook d1, just putting the rook to the open file. Played queen to e7, just in case, getting the queen out of the way. Knight to b5, white is trying to attack, getting ready to maybe break through with pawn to d6, and we do not want that. Why you don't want that? You want to keep the center locked, because you want to push your attack on the king side, and for that you want to shut down your opponent's counterplay in the middle of the board or on the queen side. So I wanted to stop this thing, and I played rook to a6 to get some additional control of this square. Now, white captured on f5, which is another very common positional mistake. Again, of course, you need to evaluate the specific situation. Maybe if your opponent has a very direct follow-up, he can win some material that could be dangerous. But in most cases, in general, that is not the move to play. Why is that so? Well, first of all, again, to take is a mistake, right? For the OGs, you know that usually an unprovoked exchange only helps your opponent. And in this case, it's just the same thing. Think about it. If we take and black recaptures with his pawn, what are the pawns that were actually eliminated from the board? In fact, white traded his e4 pawn for black's g6 pawn, right? Those 2 pawns got disappeared as a result of this trade. And in general chess, you want to move forward, you want to advance and later attack your opponent. Therefore, you want to keep your advanced pieces, you want to keep your advanced pawns. You do not want to trade them off for someone less active. And this is exactly what is happening. White is trading his powerful, advanced central pawn for the pawn on g6, which we're not doing much. By the way, if you want to learn all the main rules of positional play, I've got a free masterclass about this. I'll drop the link down below. You can check it out later. Now, after the trade, but you can see that even for a strong player, it's still hard to navigate these positional intricacies of the position. That's why it's so good for you to play. After this video, you will know what to do, while your opponents will be kind of very often clueless. White played rook to e1. That was the idea of white, trying to put pressure down here, but the pawn can go forward, also potentially attacking this knight in the future. White moved the knight away, and now rook to g6. That's another beauty of the king's Indian defense. When you initially play pawn to f5, and you start launching your attack there, it doesn't seem really dangerous for white because there is no direct threat. But your attack snowballs gradually. You keep it expanding on the king side, and you keep bringing more pieces there. And within the next like 5 moves, once white realizes that it's getting dangerous, there's nothing they can do. It's a very common scenario here. I played knight to f1 just to keep more harmony between pieces, bishop to e5. I just want to keep all of my pieces to point towards the king. White played f4, trying to kick the bishop out, but now I sack the knight right here. And after bishop takes f4, we got to the position where you can see that now the queen is somewhere out there, the rook is somewhere out there, this bishop is active, and that's how you develop your attack, right? Queen f2, attack the bishop retreats, king h1, white is just trying to get the king out of this file, king h8, black is getting ready to double up, knight d2, rook g8, hits the bishop, rook to g1, and notice that literally all pieces of black are now pointing toward the king side. They are either attacking the king side directly, or they're very close, like even this bishop, right? If black ever moves the pawn forward, the bishop will be right there. But right now, there's this little combo, bishop takes, opening up the king, now queen to e5 check, and white resigned, because here we've got a quick checkmate. And this is a general plan which in different variations often occur. You start expanding on the king side, you gradually shift more pieces there, and then you break through. And in this game, white played another very common mistake. White developed the bishop to d3. And you may be wondering, hey, what's wrong with such a natural development move? Well, this bishop breaks the connection between a queen and this pawn on d4, and that allows you to attack it. Black goes bishop g4. This time we want to pin this knight, which is currently the main defender of this pawn and the only defender. White wanting to get rid of the pin, black traded off, and then played knight to c6, hitting this pawn. Now white already feels the drawback of his previous development. The pawn is attacked. If it ever goes forward, of course we're not going to retreat. The knight will jump forward, maybe to e5, or even better to d4, to this excellent active square. So if white pushes, you go forward, hit the queen, and keep this knight on this great central square. White didn't want that. White tried to just protect the pawn. But black played knight to d7, opening up the bishop pressure. And now we've got the second attacker to the same pawn. White added the second defender, and white thought that everything's good. Now finally everything is under control, and this is exactly the moment where black initiated this nightmare. Knight to e5, sacrifice of a knight, which leads to this fork, to the queen and the bishop. The queen has to go, but now knight takes d3, and this knight is a real forkaholic. This time the king needs to get out of the danger, but now black grabs this pawn, hits the other pawn on c4, and white is totally destroyed. There's an aggressive plan that your opponents can choose to play, known as the Samisch Variation, pawn to f3, and once you castle, they go bishop to e3. Now, their intent is actually quite sudden. Typically, in the King's Indian, you attack on the king side. You play e5, and down the line, you get this knight out of the way, you play f5, and you start expanding there. However, in this line, they want to turn the tables, and they want to attack on the king side. Their goal is to play queen to d2, castle queenside, and then push these pawns forward, go with the bishop h6, straight your bishop, and checkmate you along this h-file. Oops, not this one, this one. So that is their plan. And it can be really dangerous if you don't know how to counter it. But since we know their plan, it's easy to counteract. We're going to open up the king side and potentially even a little bit of the queen side, expecting them to castle there. You start by going pawn to c5. This is another quite common pawn break in the center because you don't have that many, right? Since you've got a pawn on d6, you can either undermine white center with pawn to e5 or pawn to c5. In most cases, we advance this pawn, but in this line, pawn to c5 makes sense. Now, we want to also clear the diagonal for this bishop. In the long run, it's going to help our attack. Now, first off, how about white simply capturing this pawn? In most cases, they won't, because it's not what they want to do, right? They want to play queen d2, h4, h5, and attack our king. That's their plan. While trying to capture this pawn on c5, yes, they can win it after an exchange, but they waste a lot of time doing so while they're underdeveloped. And they also open up this diagonal for your bishop once again. And in light of that, you will have a lot of compensation for that little pawn, and their plan breaks. That's the main issue for them. It does not give them an advantage. That's why typically they will try to play d5, keep the center closed, and they want to insist on the same plan and checkmate you on the king side. You play pawn to e6, we still try to open things up. White is underdeveloped, want to take advantage of that. White goes queen d2, we take. Now, recapturing with the e-pawn would be really bad for white because now the e-file will become a problem for them. In most cases, they will recapture with this one. You can still put the rook to e8, just a useful rule for different situations to get the rook right here in this type of positions. Now, what can white play here? I mean, typically either castle queenside, which now is not as appealing as it was before, or maybe trying bishop h6. If they try bishop h6 right away, trying to take away this main defender of your king, there's a nice little combo, knight takes e4. You attack the queen, and after white captures anyhow with a pawn or knight, doesn't matter, you play queen h4 check, that's the trick. It's a double attack, and then on the next turn you grab this bishop on h6. As a result of this little operation, you snatch the pawn, that one on e4, you also got this really great bishop on this long diagonal, and you have a winning position. Of course, you still need to convert it, but you have a winning advantage. If your opponent does not fall for the trap and just castles or plays any other move, then you can play pawn to a6 and start expanding on the queen side, and your attack is simply faster. You started it earlier. Also, you have this nice bishop which will support it. If white tries to trade it off, now you have a nice option, bishop to h8. And that's why it was good for us not to have our rook on f8, otherwise you'd lose it. But since the rook is on e8, now bishop h8 is perfectly possible and is a great move to play. You save this bishop, it's good for defending your king, it's also good for counterattack along this diagonal, therefore it's a really great piece. And then you'll continue with b5, b4, and you're much faster in your attack. One more thing that amateurs love playing a lot is this 4-pawn attack, where white goes pawn to f4. Your opponent has made it clear that he knows how pawns move. What are we going to do about that? People love this system because it's very aggressive, right? White puts all these pawns out there, hoping to maybe play e5 down the line, but there is also a clear drawback. White is stretching out his position too much without enough development, and also his king is still vulnerable. Therefore, your plan overall is to counter-strike in the center, to open things up, either with this push or with this one. And as soon as you open the position, you will then be able to attack all these hanging pawns and the centralized king, and you'll get this massive counterplay. There are different ways to go about this, but just to get out of theory, because otherwise it's annoying to try to study that, I recommend the same trick, knight to a6. The same idea that we used when there was no pawn on f4, which we used in the main line of the King's Indian, you can use it here just as well. You go knight a6, and then you still strike e5. You can't ignore that white even has this pawn on f4, and again in the King's Indian, you're often okay with sacrificing a pawn to speed up your attack, and also to clear the diagonal for your bishop. Now after e5, let's say white captures, and what can they do now? Now this pawn is hanging. If they capture on e5, that's rarely a good idea for white, basically never. You're going to take on d1, and then this pawn is going to fall anyway, your knight will come to g4 and will pick it up. Therefore, that's not dangerous. If white captures it with a knight, then it looks good for white temporarily, but this whole thing is very shaky. You undermine the center, and then there's knight takes e4 trick. You use the power of this bishop. That's why we wanted to open up the diagonal for this bishop so much. White takes, bishop takes e5, now we've got this great bishop pointing to both sides of the board, and after white castles, you can even reinforce this attack with a queen, attacking this pawn, attacking this knight, and you're not winning yet, but you definitely seize the initiative and you're the one attacking. What if your opponent says, thanks, I'm on a diet, and he just pushes the pawn forward? Now we know that we've got this excellent square for the knight, we move it there, we hit the central pawn, white tries to defend it, but there's another nightmare tactic. We sacrifice the knight there anyway. And then you play bishop to f5 to pin this knight down to the queen, and now we're attacking it twice. We're still capitalizing on the fact that white is underdeveloped and overextended. And both of those things are great for you to launch your own attack. Now white needs to guard the knight, let's say white plays this, but now after an exchange you play f5, this time we're hitting the bishop comes back, and now you can play e4, either right away or after an exchange. You can then play e4 with a double attack, and you were down a knight, but not anymore, you're getting it back. A pony saved is pony earned. And then after white recaptures anyhow, you've got rook to e8 check, and you start this massive attack against an uncastled king, while have to move it, losing the right to castle, and then you just keep attacking it. If white goes bishop e3, that fails because the bishop is pinned. You can attack it for the second time, and now you're totally winning. Fischer was great in playing the King's Indian defense, and if you want to know Fischer's 3 main rules to boost your results, check out this video.